Okay, so let's continue going over how we can bring shadows into our drawings in Rhino. So continuing from the last video, we are in a top view, so with the render mode on. And so these shadows are casting red because in the last video we turned them from black to red, so that when we trace them, it's super clear where they are. And like we might think that this is a shadow, but because we've turned our shadows red, we know that this is actually just a dark surface. And in fact, our shadow is being cast here. So I have shadows for the objects. I have the volumes that are our architecture. I have shadows for the people, the scale figures that I have in the model. And we basically want to make an image file from this so that we can bring it in under our Make 2D drawing and trace our shadow outlines. So to do that, we're actually going to print from the model space, and I want to hit print here. Right, and what pops up? Nothing at all nothing that looks like what we want, right? So let's hit cancel here because, well, actually, let me go ahead and show you that. First of all, we don't want a PDF. We want an image file. So from Rhino, you can print to an image. So in the pull down under destination, select image file. I like PNGs. You can decide later. This is also not exactly what we want. First of all, we need to figure out the proportion, and we want a pretty high resolution for this so we have detail to trace. So I'm going to close this and just show you that this surface, we'll use this surface that that everything is on as a reference point for our image. I've measured that surface, so it's 130 feet by 155 feet in this direction. And when I'm just hitting Control P on the keyboard, I'm going to start with I basically want to use that to set our proportion. So I could start with 130 pixels by 155 pixels. That's not so great. So I want to bump up to 1300 by 1550. That still this 1300 by 1550 resolution might still be a little small. So why don't I just double that? So that's going to be 2600 by, I believe, 3100 pixels. So it's keeping the proportion, right? And but now we want to center we basically want this image to fill the image file that we're making. So we come down to View, Output, and Scale. Instead of Viewport, we want to select Window. And by default, we get to set that window. We're going to go to the endpoint. I have my object snaps on. I can find the endpoint there. Again, this is a little wacky, so don't worry about it. Just click the points on the edge of the surface, or whatever your reference geometry is. Hit Enter. And now you can see it's filling the page at the resolution, which is the same proportion as what we know exists in the model viewport. So I'm going to hit Print. So then it's going to save it as a JPEG. I want a PNG. You can see that I've done this before, kind of testing this. So I'll call this Shadow Plan Tutorial. And hit Save. And it's going to take just a minute. Oh, nope, it saved pretty quickly. So let's go back to our shaded view. And I'm going to hit Show to turn all of the other geometry back on. And so this is where I want to draw my shadows. To put the image file in, I am going to type Picture. There used to be, well, there's still a command called background bitmap. Picture is a lot more flexible. So use Picture. This is the image file that we just made. Shadow Plan Tutorial. Hit Open. Okay, now I am going to click. I have the same reference here, and I set it like that. Okay, and when I look at this, let's see how close. So there's always going to be a little bit of discrepancy between the image file that you make and your geometry in Rhino. So the great thing about Picture, this used to be a real pain with background bitmap, but now I can just scale this and move this. So I have the picture selected, I'm moving it, I'm picking a couple of points, and so that edge should really be more like, let's say like right there. So that looks pretty good. And now I want to scale it. Now it's important that you don't have ortho on for this. Maybe I want to move this over just a little bit. So I'm hitting move and I'm just kind of tweaking it. Okay, that looks better. So now I am going to make sure I have it selected, scale it, ortho. Your ortho drawing guide is off. I'm clicking that point, and then I'm going to come down to a point down here, and I'll use that as the other reference point. So let's say kind of click the end of that and then snap it to that point. Okay, now we have this like lined up really well. It won't be absolutely perfect, but it's going to be close enough that we can draw a nice shadow on our plan. So at this point, you could put the picture surface on a layer and lock that layer, or you could simply select it and hit lock. If I ever want to unlock it, I just need to type unlock, and then I can select it again. So let's just lock it. And then again, even in the future, if you're going into Illustrator, I would advise you, for hatches in Illustrator, you could use the same technique. Just go ahead and draw these polygons as complete polygons in advance. So again, I'm tracing these shadows. And again, like here, it's not quite snapping, but you know that it's going to not quite lining up. Okay, so I had that line. I should have continued, so I am just going to go ahead and finish it off by drawing the rest of that polygon, hitting enter. So now I have this line. Oops, select the right one, that one, this one. I'm going to join them, and I have a closed curve. Okay, great. So I'm just going to go ahead and what I'll do is show you with this one how I've set up the shadows. I'm going to go ahead and unlock this thing. I'm just going to hide it, so I don't need to see it. Okay, cool. So now I have this line. The way I've set it up in this drawing is that I have a shadow line layer, and I have a bunch of stuff on there already. So I have everything drawn already. So, but let's just make a new layer here. Tutorial. Shadow. Okay, I'm going to make a layer inside that called shadow line. There we go. Okay, and I'm going to right click, change object layer. So now that object is on shadow line. Okay, now let's say I just want a black shadow. I'm going to create a new layer here. Shadow hatch black. There we go. Okay, cool. Now I can just type hatch. All I have to do is type hatch. By default, we get a solid hatch. This is pretty easy. It's just one closed polyline. I can hit OK. Now, if you have more complicated things in Rhino, it's something like this, right, where I have these two shapes. If I type hatch, let's see here. It's hatching everything. There's another way to do this, boundary hatch. What is it? Hatch boundary. Okay, if I don't have them selected and I type hatch, then I can change this from boundary no to boundary yes, and hit enter. Okay, now you can click inside the regions where you want to hatch. So let's say I just want to hatch that. Okay, cool. Now I've got that. Let me undo that. Again, type hatch. Hatch. Boundary, yes. Select the curves, enter. Inside regions that I want to keep, maybe I want just those two, right? Or actually, let me do this again. Enter boundary, yes. Click these things, there we go. So I want those two. Okay, that makes more sense. There we go. So then we have that. So, so hatching is really flexible. Let's say I, have something like this, for example. I can click these two guys, or I can type hatch. Actually, it should automatically make the hole. If I type hatch, nope, it automatically says click the regions to keep. There we go. Okay, cool. So then I can do something like that with two close polylines. So that works pretty well. Okay, so let's say that I want a pattern on top of that, which is what the original drawing that we've been working on shows. Let me turn off this one. Oops, I want to put it on this layer, shadow black, or shadow hatch black. Change object layer. Okay, cool. Now I'm going to make a new sublayer here. We'll call it shadow hatch line. Okay, cool. Oops, there's a little thing there that I didn't want. And maybe I'll move this, probably want to move this layer on top of the black layer, simply because this will, those lines will be on top of the black tone. All right, select this. I'm going to hatch it again. Okay, and enter. Now boundary hatches. I understand what's happening. Boundary hatch is now set to the default. So I want to put this grid on it. Pattern rotation. We'll deal with all of that later. So we're going to hit OK. All right. So I want both the print color of this to be white. We don't have any, we do have some layouts in this, but, and we also want the color of the layer to be white, so it displays properly. And now if we put this, right click and move it, change object layer, we can see that it's showing up white. And if we turn on the black layer, there we go. Okay, cool. So now we have this showing up over the black. So I'm just going to go ahead and lock the black layer, right? Okay, and then here with the pattern rotation and the pattern scale, the rotation, we could begin to change this by, if we put in 45 versus 0, then that changes. You could also change this hatch, for example, to align. And then you could rotate, again, if you select that pattern, you could rotate it at 45 degrees, something like that, right? And then you could, of course, change the scale of this thing to 5, or what was it before? It was 1. So if we went 0.25, then they become a lot closer together. And so there is something a little tricky with hatches. It's not really that tricky, but so I already have all of this set up. So let's look at, so this, I think we've shown how you draw the shadow hatches or any other hatches that you'd be interested in. Now let's go ahead and turn on all of this stuff. All right, so here I have all of my shadow hatches. Now this, let me go ahead and lock the black hatch again. What am I showing here? All right, I have a pattern rotated at 45. So this one I could change to 90. Looks like we have multiple hatches on here. This is interesting. Maybe we had 2 here. Let's try that. Maybe there we go. So that one's rotating. Okay, cool. And I can also scale this one. So let's scale it to 1. Okay, great. So this one is now bigger than this hatch, right? So that all seems to make sense. But let's see if it makes sense when we're on the layout. Let's hide that. Okay. So if I'm in here and come in and click this to 1. Okay, that's bigger. That's great. So that all makes sense. Now, let's look at something else that may or may not make sense. Here, let's make this pretty big. And these guys are smaller. Okay. So, and these colors are just from earlier in the tutorial when I made this layer color red. So we'll just go ahead and, so it's not confusing, make this black. And down here, I can make this one, which was green. I can make it black. Okay, cool. All right. So what you'll see here is that these hatches, even though the drawings are at different scales, this one is like basically at 1 to 32. And this one is, let's just make it 1/8, right? Those hatches are the same size. So this triangle is exactly the same size as this triangle. And if we were to come in here and scale this one, say we want it to be like 0.1, right? It gets, they still say this, they stay the same size. That is because we're using something called hatch scaling. So hatch. And I think that on the whole, this is probably desirable, this behavior. But if you want to override it, or if you want the hatch to really scale with the drawings, then what we need to do is type hatch scale. And we can see here that scaling is enabled. If we turn off scaling, let's disable it. Scaling disabled. Enter. Okay. Now we can see that things change, and we can't actually, looks like something's gone really wonky up here, but I think it's just because the lines are so close together that we can't see the black tone anymore. So let's jump in here. Let's change the pattern scale to something like 50 or 5. Let's try that. Okay, cool. Now what we see here is that the triangles are different sizes, right? So we have a kind of global size for this triangle. So when the drawing's at a smaller scale, the triangles are smaller, and when the drawing is at a larger scale, the triangles are bigger. And so if you want that behavior, you want to turn hatch scaling off. And then when you set this pattern scale for the particular hatch pattern, you can basically let's see, change everything at once, right? I'm sorry, or you're changing everything here. If you turn on, let's go back to hatch scaling. So let's go back to hatch scale. Let's put on, enable hatch scaling again, enter. Okay, now you have a global hatch scale factor, which we saw up here. Hatch scale, maybe I didn't touch on it. Oops. Hatch scale. Scaling is enabled, and it has a scale factor. We can change that scaling. And how do we change the hatch scale? Hatch base. I know actually if we go into options, and let's see if we go to annotation styles, grid hatch, here's where we can change that, right? So if we change it from 8 to 4, that should do something. Options. Didn't seem to. I don't know why. Maybe it has to do with the model space. If we go into the model space. But anyway, it doesn't matter. But I would just leave that scale constant 8 or something like that. And now if we go back to 0.55 or something like that, if you have hatch scale on, then basically your triangles will always be the same. And you can still scale them up or down, but when as you zoom in and out, they're going to remain the same size, which could either be desirable or undesirable, but using hatch scale you can change the behavior. So I think that pretty much covers the basics of how you would use Rhino for drawing. Maybe I will just show you dimensions in one more tutorial, and I can add tutorials as you have questions or there are other things that I think of to show you. So let's do one more tutorial where we look at dimensions, and we will then think about if there's anything else to show you. Okay.